Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to our end of the day story. Today's chapter is chapter 22 of Charlotte's Web, and it's called A Warm Wind. And so Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. His was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a Medal of Honor. In his mouth he held a sack of spiders' eggs. There is no place quite like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children carefully in a safe corner. The barn smelled good. His friends, the sheep and the geese, were glad to see him. The geese gave him a specially noisy welcome. "Congratulations!" they cried. "Nice work!" Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen, where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself could look at it whenever he wanted to. In the days that followed, Wilbur was very happy. He grew to a great size, and he no longer worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. But Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway, and every day Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come to his throat. No one had ever had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, or so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought in the squashes and pumpkins from the garden and piled them on the barn floor where they wouldn't get nipped on frosty nights. The maples and birches turned bright colours, and the wind shook them, and they dropped their leaves one by one to the ground. Under the wild apple trees in the pasture, the red little apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed them, and the geese gnawed them, and the foxes came in the night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began falling, and it covered the house, the barn, the fields, and the woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and ploughed the drifts in his yard, just for the fun of it. Fern and Avery arrived, dragging a sledge, and they coasted down the lane and out onto the frozen pond in the pasture. "Coasting is the most fun there is," said Avery. "The most fun there is," retorted Fern, "is when the Ferris wheel stops and Henry and I are in the top car and Henry makes the car swing and we can see everything for miles and miles." "Goodness, are you still thinking of that old Ferris wheel?" said Avery in disgust. "The fair was weeks ago." "I think about it all the time," said Fern, picking snow from her ear. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 below zero, and cold settled on the world. The pasture was bleak and frozen, and the cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except on some sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard in the lee of the straw pile. The sheep stayed near the barn too, for protection. When they were thirsty, they ate snow. And the geese hung around the barnyard the way boys hang around a drugstore, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them cheerful. "Many, many, many, many thanks," they always said when they saw the food coming. Templeton moved indoors when winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly for him, so he fixed himself a cosy nest in the barn behind the grain bins. He lined it with bits of dirty newspapers and rags, and whenever he found a trinket or a keepsake, he carried it home and stored it there. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime. But Wilbur kept the promise he had made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then, when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any rat you ever saw. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. "You would live longer," said the old sheep, "if you ate less." "Oh, who wants to live forever anyway?" sneered the rat. "I am a naturally heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast." He patted his stomach and grinned at the sheep, and then crept upstairs to lie down. All winter, Wilbur watched over Charlotte's egg sack as though guarding his own children. He had scooped out a special place in the manure for the sack next to the board fence. On very cold nights he lay so that his breath would warm it. For Wilbur, nothing in life was more important than this small round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently, he awaited the end of the winter and the coming of the little spiders. Life is always a rich and steady time when you are waiting for something to happen. And the winter ended at last. "I heard the frogs today," said the old sheep one evening. "Listen, you can hear them now." Wilbur stood still and cocked his ears. From the pond, in a shrill chorus, came the voices of hundreds of little frogs. "Springtime," said the old sheep thoughtfully. "Another spring." And as she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her, only a few hours old. The snows melted and ran away. The streams and ditches bubbled and chattered with rushing water. A sparrow with a streaky breast arrived and sang. The light strengthened, the mornings came sooner. Almost every morning there was another new lamb in the sheepfold, and the goose was sitting on 9 new eggs, and the sky seemed wider and a warm wind blew. The last remaining strands of Charlotte's web floated away and vanished. One fine sunny morning, after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching the precious sack. He wasn't thinking about anything much, and as he stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. It was a tiny spider crawling from the sack, no bigger than a grain of sand, no bigger than the head of a pin. Its body was grey with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were grey. It looked just like Charlotte. And we'll finish that chapter here. The last part of Charlotte's Web is tomorrow, so I hope you're looking forward to it, and I hope you've enjoyed our story. Good night, everybody.